Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second edition of the Saga Salon. The Saga Salon is a monthly event series hosted by Saga Press, the speculative fiction imprint at Simon Schuster. Each month, a stellar panel of authors do a deep dive into a specific topic about almost anything from bending time to building worlds. This month, we're celebrating the release of the year's best science fiction, Volume 1, Saga's new anthology series. Join authors Charlie Jane Anders, Elizabeth Bear, Malka Older, Fran Wilde, and moderator Jonathan Strahan as they look back and deliver their very own sci-fi State of the Union, which is very appropriate prelude to tonight's debate, I am sure. You can purchase the book at a link that I will drop into the chat momentarily. And I'm Lauren Jackson. I'm the publicity and marketing manager at Saga Press. On that note, I am going to turn it over to Jonathan and go invisible.
Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, everybody, for making the time to join us today, for coming in, for being part of it. As Lauren very capably introduced, our panelists today are the wonderful Charlie Jane Anders, Elizabeth Bear, Malka Older, and Fran Wilde. Fran Wilde.
She's wilder than that.
Best-selling, award-winning, wonderful writers. We only have a fairly short period of time. We've got this enormous subject. You know, when I think about a State of the Union, I think about, well, actually, hopefully about a televised version involving like Martin Sheen on the West Wing rather than any real State of the Union, where they talk about what the state of the United States is and what it's up to. We're going to set that aside and talk about the state of science fiction. What we're probably not going to do is get too much bogged down in what we each individually think sci-fi, SF, science fiction, speculative fiction is, but get straight into the subject at hand, which is, what is the state of science fiction? We're caught in this strange, difficult, weird COVID year. And so how do we feel we're going? Are things going well? Are things going poorly? I'm going to throw straight to you, Bear. Charlie Jane. I don't want to go out of order. Straight to you, Charlie Jane, and say, what do you think the state of science fiction is right now? How are we going?
I mean, I think it's going really well. It's obviously it's a weird year. We can't get together in person. There's no conventions. It's a weird time, but there's so much great stuff being published right now. My God, like especially this month, September has just seen so many incredible books. I feel like this year has seen more, interesting, challenging, diverse, mind-blowing, kind of hopeful storytelling than I've seen pretty much ever. I feel like there's just been so much great stuff published this year. I'm excited to be reading all of it. Like I've just got piles and piles and piles of books that have come out this year that I'm just like devouring. And I feel like it's a really great time to be reading the genre. I don't know.
And how about you, Bear? What do you think the state of science fiction is for you as a reader in this and participant as a writer in this strange year?
I think Charlie Jane is absolutely correct that the diversity we are currently experiencing, this explosion of voices and perspectives, is the real strength of our generation of science fiction writers and the generation following us. It's the thing that we bring to the table that the genre has been lacking before. And I find that the stories that are being told may have some superficial similarities in terms of plot or the novum. Sorry, I got all technical. The big idea, but that when you interrogate them from a new perspective, you get an entirely different story. I think that's the thing that started with Samuel Delany and Joanna Russ and Ursula Le Guin, and that is a thread that plays through to our current generations of writers.
Okay. Malka, what about you? What's your feeling on the state of science fiction at the moment?
Definitely echoing all of that. And, I think I've seen some really creative responses to quarantines as well. I just saw, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I think it was Andy Buchanan, correct me if I'm wrong, who with a group of other people were all writing themed novellas during the quarantine. And things like that, where people were actually getting together to do things creatively, or people who were on their own we're trying to work through it. And also totally fair. If it was not a creative moment for you, also fine. But I think we are seeing some interesting responses and reactions coming out. And there's one other thing which I want to point out, which is maybe a little bit tangential to most of our experiences as writers and readers. But I feel like right now there's a moment where there's a ton of attention being paid to science fiction from universities, from think tanks, from militaries, from futurists. And there's this sort of sense suddenly that this could be something for people to tap into, a new intellectual vein, a new imaginative vein, which has been there all along, but that is starting to get some more of this legitimacy and attention, which is not necessarily a good thing. It can be problematic in some ways, but it can also be, it can be really great that in terms of opening up to reaching more audiences and getting out the ideas of imagination and diversity and different futures to more people.
And how about you, Fran? From your neck of the woods, how does science fiction look in 2020?
You know, from my neck of the woods, it's really interesting because we're all sort of sitting around our own digital campfires in like Brady Bunch form, all squared up. And this is the future, as the Jetsons thought. We're living this thing where we're all getting on our phones and talking to each other across space and time. And in some ways that makes it more accessible. And in some ways it makes it less accessible. Like, we need to have Wi-Fi as a public surface. It's like water now. Why aren't we doing this? And there's so many things that we need to change about our world to make it more real and more forward thinking and forward facing. I think, you know, from a writer's standpoint, the writer's room of 2020, this has been said by many, many brilliant people, including pretty much everybody here, is really kind of jumped the shark about 60 times. And there is, there's a bit of a feeling, at least in my corner, that the apocalypse is so very last year, and we need to start looking forward into what we want to make next and how we can make it work. But also from a teacher's standpoint, I know that my students are looking for the next thing. They're hungry to see what the world brings them, not just the Western facing world, but also just everything that's out there. And this is a moment where we're all sort of on a generation ship, you know, traveling together through time. And when we come out of it, what we're going to bring with us is our stories. So I'm hopeful. I think word of mouth is what's driving a lot of science fiction right now. And so for that, I want to double back to the person who led off with this. And thank you, Charlie Jane, because I follow your recs all the time. Everybody here should. And you were the person that gave me the Space Between Worlds, which I think is one of the best stories of so far of 2020. Micaiah Johnson's novel, it's amazing. Time travel, multi-world theory, and I love it. So thank you. That was not, well, that was more of a statement than a question.
No, but it actually really segues really neatly into, I guess, the next question that I have, because we find ourselves here in this strange, paused, kind of terrifying time, right? We're all locked in, or people around the world are locked in to different extents, are facing different challenges, but are still somehow being brought more globally together intellectually, conceptually, than maybe they ever have been before, because we find ourselves in this strange year going through the same thing. So I guess my question is, as a locked-in futurist, right? As a locked-in futurist, how hard is it to imagine the future in any realistic way? And how can science fiction respond? I'm going to go back to the top to Charlie Jane. What are your thoughts? How do you go about imagining the future today and see anything on the other side of this fog and do something that connects with readers in a useful way?
I mean, it's really hard. Writing about the near future right now is extremely difficult because we don't really know what the world is going to look like in 2023 or even 2021 to a large extent. Like, it's so hard to predict like the world of like a year or two from now. And Anna Lee Newitz, my partner and co-host of Our Opinions Are Correct, wrote a thing for New Scientist in the latest issue about like your hope horizon. What's your horizon for like the future? How far into the future do you want to imagine things being kind of okay again, kind of? And it's a really tough time right now. I think that, you know, We know that there's going to be the intermediate future is going to be rough and also just really confusing and weird and hard to grapple with. And that at some point we'll get past that and there will be something new and maybe it'll be something better. And I think that, you know, part of what I love about Malka's work, for example, is that Malka gives us kind of an intermediate future, like a future that's like, you know, still this century, but a ways ahead in which we have really built a new system and it's different and it's better and it's so daring. And like, I feel like, you know, I tried really hard to write about the near future and all the birds in the sky and, you know, stuff like, oh my gosh, what if there were heat waves in San Francisco? What if there were superstorms hitting, you know, the coast? What if there's forest fires and plagues? Like I kind of was like, oh gosh, this all feels really like I'm reaching, saying that this is going to happen in the near future. And then by the time the book was published, that stuff was already happening. And it's now, you know, the book feels like it's no longer like the near future stuff in that book now feels like it's about a year or two ago. And so it's really hard. It's really hard, especially now, to predict a near future scenario. And I think that, you know, like I was writing in my latest essay at Tor.com that just came out, it's good to get weird. I think right now it's good to just be really super weird and imagine the weirdest future you can, because it probably won't be as weird as what's going to actually happen.
Oh, and what about you, Bear? What are you able to imagine the future at the moment, or is it just
well, it's my job, so I hope so. I've actually had sort of a similar experience to Charlie Jane's, where my first published novel, which came out now 15 years ago, is a, you know, bleak dystopian post-climate change future that postulates a ineffectual government having marginalized the United States on the world stage forever. I'm feeling like maybe I don't want to write science fiction anymore if this is what's going to happen. But we always get stuff wrong. You know, our terrible cyberpunk dystopia of 2020 was supposed to involve much less comfortable clothing. Like much more black leather, fewer hedgehog pajamas. And I actually kind of personally prefer the hedgehog pajamas. But yeah, you know, so I think that when you are writing about the near future, I just came face to face with this. I wrote a short story back in, I think, 2008 or 2009. I guess it was a novella that was about futuristic policing in Bangalore. And I just this year wrote a sequel to that story for Audible. And the really interesting thing was like how much more, because India, of course, is also dealing with a you know, crypto-fascist nationalistic government right now. Like how much easier it was to write that hopeful world in 2009. Hopeful post-climate change adapted world. But I'm like, but it's still 60 years in the future, right? It's still, there's a lot of water under the bridge between 2020 and 2060. So it's near future in that it is, you know, plausibly in my lifetime, if I live a really long time, if I bust some records. But, you know, certainly, very definitely in the expected lifetimes of people being born today. And I had to think about like what the 1950s would have looked like, you know, like science fiction futurism from the 1920s and how they visualized the 1950s as opposed to the real 1950s we got. And the real 1960s we got. And all of the terrible things that happened in that 50-year period, and the I'm sort of rambling. I'm sorry, but you can't extrapolate the future from any single moment in time, even though our tendency is always to assume that what is going on now is what is going to be going on forever. Okay. And really, that's not how time works.
Okay.
At least in my experience of my 49 years on the planet, that's not how time works.
Well, let me ask you, Malka, how is it, how are you able to see the future from where you are? Does it, is it possible to engage with this, well, one of the many missions of science fiction to talk about and think about the science fiction in 2020 or the future in 2020?
Well, I've always found near future kind of terrifying for that reason, because you don't know how quickly you're going to be made obsolete. And, there's a reason why my fiction is also set sort of like farther near or early mid or something, whatever you want to call it, because the closer it is, the sooner you're going to be proven wrong. And to take a really low stakes example, in one of my books, I mentioned kind of offhand Kazakhstan and the capital of Kazakhstan, which they changed the name of last year. So they changed the name of the capital. And I'm like holding out a little bit that they might change it back before my books take place, because people do change names back. But it's a thing that happens. So I think when I was writing, I really had to let go at some point of the idea that I was trying in any way to predict an accurate future, and just really recognize that we're not talking. We're extrapolating from some things, and there are some things that I certainly accidentally unfortunately predicted because it was going that way. Yeah, that's there. And there's some things that I put down because I was kind of hoping that an engineer or inventor would read my book and be like, oh yeah, I should invent that. And that might happen. That would be nice. But for the most part, we're really talking about the present. We're finding ways to write about the present and to show ourselves, our world, with enough of a twist that people can get past some of the hangups of looking at yourself in the mirror and actually see what's there.
Fran, how's the future there?
I would like to go on record as saying that I have not predicted the future. There are no giant carnivorous flying squids in happening, and
that we know about.
And there's no sentient storms knocking
bioprinted unicorns, and they're poop. I think that's gonna happen.
I just want to say, bioprinted unicorns could be fun, though. That could be all right. But there is, I think, I really liked what Charlie Jane was saying about hope horizons, because I think that's what a lot of people are writing towards now, is that sense of not necessarily okay, but possible. It's science fiction. We talk a lot about science fiction being the literature of the possible, and we're writing towards future possibles where there is this moment of like connectivity and getting together again. And it's not all, mustache twisty governments. It's actual functioning places. Like Malka's fiction is just like that in so many ways. And I love the idea that we're writing towards a hope horizon, even if we're not quite there yet. I mean, Malka and I have worked on projects together that are we have hit that moment where we're like, yes, we are writing Ninth Step Station. It is set far enough in the future that we can have Dronatow. Wait a minute, damn it. That's so not far. But it gets to you a little bit as a writer when the future is moving so fast that it actually laps you. And you want to try and outdo it, but then it's kind of a thought of maybe we just need to work with it a little bit and think like a futurist and see where we think it's going to go and hope that it gets us there in some ways. How's that?
That's great. Well, as a quick sort of follow on from the whole idea of hope horizons, yeah. Kim Stanley Robinson has said that we have as creators, there's a moral obligation to be optimistic, practically optimistic in your work. And I think what he's talking about is if you give in to despair in your fiction, then you give in to despair in life to some degree. You don't offer any way out through story. So I'm curious how the group feels about this. Do you feel when you approach your work, when you're looking at writing, that there is an imperative to try to be optimistic in what you're doing ultimately? I mean, we're talking about, by the way, about a man who starts a book off with 25 million people dying in a heat wave. We're not talking Pollyanna stuff, but that if you give in to despair in fiction, that's not something that the world really needs right now. So what would you say, starting at the top one more time? Charlie, Jane, do you think we're morally obliged to be optimists?
Oh, I mean, I get a little itchy when people talk about fiction and having a moral obligation. Like, I feel like that seems like that could easily be like the glide path that leads to like some bad storytelling choices. Like, I feel like you have to follow the story where the story goes, and you have to tell the story that you need to tell. And maybe that's a pessimistic story, maybe it's an optimistic story. I was on a panel a while ago with Cory Doctorow, who said that optimism is why there were not enough lifeboats on the Titanic. Hope is why people kept paddling. So hope is good. Hope is like, we're going to just keep going as if there could be a way. We're not going to give up. We're going to keep trying. But optimism is like, oh, it's fine. There's not going to be an iceberg. It's going to be totally fine. And we don't need lifeboats for everybody. And so,
but isn't practical optimism the fuel of hope?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that, optimism is sort of hoping for the best, I think. And hope is like, even if the worst happens, we're going to get through it somehow. We're going to survive. And I think that, I think my favorite kind of hope is the hope of, the hope that encompasses the possibility that some really, really terrible stuff, like that heat wave with the 25 million people dying, some really terrible stuff could happen, but we're not going to give up. We're going to keep going. And I think that, I think Stan would probably agree with that. I think Stan would probably co-sign that. But I think that the moral obligation of the author is to be honest, first of all, and not present stories that you don't believe in, because I think that's usually bad storytelling. If you're like, well, I think that we're fucked, but I'm going to pretend that we're not because it'll sell books or whatever, But on the other hand, I think that you also do, I think that I'm going to put this in the broadest sense because I really hate, it makes me very itchy to start prescribing it all. I think that unless you're just writing for yourself and you're never going to show it to anybody else, you have an obligation to think about your reader and to think about who your reader is and what you're communicating to your reader, and whether you want your reader to go just jump off a bridge after reading your book, kind of. And I think that, and I try to write the books that I would want to read, like everybody always says you should do. And the books that I would want to read are generally not books that leave me wanting to claw my face off at the end of reading them. So I think that, and I think that it really comes down to questions. I promise I'm almost done. It really comes down to questions about human nature and how you're portraying human nature, because really we're not talking about like optimism or hope about like just what insects are going to do. We're talking about humans and what humans are going to do and how we're going to respond to difficult situations. And I'm a qualified optimist about human nature. I think that humans in the end will do the right thing. After we've tried every wrong thing twice, we will finally do the right thing. And I think that, I think that presenting like a completely just, Hobbesian view of human nature is a little bit tiresome. So that's what I would say.
Okay. What say you, Bear? Pragmatic optimism?
What she said. I mean, I could put on my Peter Watts contrarian hat here, and
what kind of hat is that? What kind of hat?
I think it's one of those giant carnivorous flying squids.
Is it a sombrero? Is it like a?
They're not headgear. It's a.
Okay, well, I'm putting on my hat.
Oh no, she's got a hat. I think that there is.
Oh, see.
I absolutely agree with Charlie Jane, who beautiful. Who whether she knows it or not is agreeing with Akira Kurosawa, my favorite Akira Kurosawa quote, which is in my email, so I know all of you have seen it, about the duty of the artist being never to close their eyes.
Okay,
the duty of the artist is to attempt to.
Sorry. It is not working with my headphones. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. You are the most fashionable thing I have seen in months. Like the duty of the artist being, not to look down. And I think that is exactly what Charlie Jane just said, and I agree with it 100%. And I cede the floor to Malka.
Malka.
I largely agree. I personally, I will take your not wanting to claw my face off at the end of a book and say I don't even want to think about itching like the entire book at this particular moment right now. I'm very much in the reading happy things space, or if not happy things, friendly things to me. So like I'm compulsively rereading Murderbot, even though that is about very serious issues and is not happy all the way through. But the voice works for me, and it's a cozy. I don't know what to say about this. I also, as a writer, and I felt differently about what I read at different points in my life, and that could probably change again. As a writer, I very strongly feel that hope is something that we do, and it's necessary. I think that both utopia and dystopia have a tendency to being boring and not particularly useful, but that's a very personal thing, and I feel it very strongly as a writer, and that's what I write, and that's what I want to read. But I also know that there are people who get there, and I don't want to put this in a way that sounds badly, but there are people who read dystopia and find it cathartic, who get something comforting out of it, not because it's terrible, but because it reflects something different from what they're in, right? And I also think that there are people who write dystopias, and it's a useful thing for other people as a warning, in the same way that me writing something hopeful can be useful to people saying, oh, here's a possibility. So while I certainly feel from my personal perspective as a writer that I want to write hopeful things, I don't think that that's necessarily the right thing for everybody, either as writers or readers.
Fair enough. Well, look, the world is in the grips of this pandemic, and we are all facing different kinds of challenges. I'm curious how you feel science fiction is coping in terms of publishing and publishing technology, and how we're... my God.
Sorry.
That was embarrassing. It's because I threw an extra question in and my
It's
timetable.
okay. I blend in.
Tells you how my mind's working at 6
The Zoom background ate her.
I can't make myself disappear.
I'm just gonna. Fran, future
Hi,
optimism.
Jonathan. I mean, what everybody said, but also I think that the act of writing itself, and even the act of picking up a book and reading it, is a hopeful act. And it's not, you don't have to be optimistic to do it. It's just like voting or connecting with somebody or reaching out and saying, hey, I need help, or hey, I'd love to talk to you about this topic. It's hard to get the first words out, but the minute you do it, you are starting on a journey that you don't know how it's going to end. And so for everybody out there who is engaged in trying to be creative in the middle of all of this, I commend your hope, and I thank you for it, and keep doing what you're doing. Keep writing and reading and voting and all of those things.
Well, we've got, with my apologies again.
No, it's
we've got
fine.
a question from, no, it's
really,
not
it's
fine.
really okay.
We got a
Don't
question
worry about
from
it.
the audience that actually fits in right here, so I might just drop it in actually. Ernest Lilly has asked us, can you surprise readers anymore? Hasn't the future already been invented and explored? And since we're talking about whether you have a moral obligation to be optimistic or anything else, seems like it drops in right now. So Fran, reversing our order, what say you? Can you still surprise readers? Have we decided what the future is?
So the problem with the future is it's always just a little bit ahead of us, and we're learners as a species, and there are many species who are good at this. Some are better than us. We like to learn things. We learn by doing, we learn by iterating, we learn by messing up, and the future is always something that is sort of just a little bit ahead of us in terms of things that we need to figure out. So I don't think we're ever going to actually get lapped by it. I joke about it a lot, and we all joke about, oh, I predicted this or I did that. But at the end of the day, somebody's going to do something dumb and invent something else, or reinvent, I don't know, what was it yesterday on Twitter, gruel. Somebody figured out how to market gruel to, really wealthy, busy people. And it's like $30 a packet now. It's oatmeal, people. There's always going to be something that matters and that is different and changing. And we're always going to want to learn how it works and how to do it differently. So I think, yes, we can always predict something new and imagine something new.
Malka, what say you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that we have such powers of invention and imagination, and as we were saying at the beginning, there's such diversity in the world that there's no way that I can imagine all the futures that someone who has had a totally different experience from me can imagine. So I think that as long as we keep opening that up to lots of people, we're going to have lots of surprising different futures to think about. And like Charlie Jane said, get weird. I mean, we can all get so much weirder, I think. So we've got plenty of room to weird it up.
What say you, Bear? Are we stuck in some Asimovian psychohistory nightmare where we know everything that's going to happen? Or can the future still surprise?
Well, my actual record of predicting things like election results and sports ball outcomes is pretty low. So, speaking only for myself, I'm bad at prediction. But the purpose of science fiction, and I alluded to this briefly earlier, the purpose of science fiction isn't actually to predict the future. That's a different discipline. That's futurism, which is something that some of us also dabble in. I'm looking at you, Charlie Jane, and Malka and Fran. So the purpose of science fiction is to reach readers reading now, and maybe if we're very lucky, for the next 20 years. It is we are speaking to the moment we find ourselves in. And what's really interesting is John Clute has this idea of the real year of a book, which is the year it's actually set in, sort of sociologically and psychologically, as opposed to the year it purports to be set in. So, for example, you might read a book written in 2000, but it really feels like 1970 in that book for whatever reason. And I think that the books that feel to us the most cutting edge, the most 5 minutes into the future, are actually the ones that are closest to our current year. And this is the thing that dawned on me when I was rereading Snow Crash in like 2016. And I'm like, this is 1990. I read the book when it came out when I was in college. And then like rereading, I'm like, it felt so futuristic. And in rereading it, I realized that it really felt like 1990. So yeah, the future is a moving target. And I see Ernest in chat is science fiction isn't about the future, it's about the present, using the future as a metaphor. And yes, exactly. And sometimes it's about the future. That's pretty much all I have to say.
Okay.
I think I've rambled long enough.
What about you, Charlie Jane? Is there still something to say about the way the future was, or has it already been seen?
Well, I mean, so when I see people saying, can you surprise readers anymore? What I really think they're talking about is tropes. And this is something that I've been kind of meaning to find a way to talk about in my writing advice essays that I've been doing. We live in a time when people are more hyper aware of tropes than they've ever been. thanks to, you know, Twitter and the internet and tvtropes.org and all these other Wikipedia and everything, people are super, super aware of tropes in a way that they haven't been before. And so it's like, oh, well, oh, this is that trope, and I've seen it in these 5 other places, and like, oh, this anime did these 27 different tropes in these different configurations. And, you know, I think that it's true that we are like more readers and consumers as well as creators are more educated about tropes than ever before. And I may have played a small role in that, like, you know, at IO9, and I think that the internet in general has done a lot to kind of further that. But these things mean something different depending on when you encounter them. And the same trope would have meant something different in 2019 than it would now, because we're bringing something different to it. And I think that, you know, the over-awareness of tropes also means that you can surprise people by making them think, oh, this is going to be friends to enemies to lovers, when actually it's friends to enemies to evil giant squid, you know, or whatever. I don't know. It's, you know, you can, the over-awareness of tropes means that people think they know where something is going more than they maybe actually do. I also think that, you know, I've been hearing for years that science fiction isn't about the future, it's about the present. I think science fiction is actually about the past most of the time. I think most of the time when we write about the future, we're really writing about the past. When we write about colonizing another planet, we're really writing about our history of colonization on this planet. When we write about, you know, wars in the future, we're really writing about wars in the past. I think most science fiction is actually historical fiction. And I wrote an essay about this recently that you can find somewhere, I forget where.
Okay. That's fascinating. I want to go read that essay now. Okay. I'm going to skip around because we've got a few questions, and I think there's something I really, really want to get to before we run out of time, which we will shortly. Science fiction is clearly, despite real stumbles, becoming more inclusive and more diverse. While COVID rages, Me Too, Black Lives Matter are having a real impact in the world around us. How do you feel diversity and inclusiveness are impacting the state of science fiction on and off the page? And are you optimistic about how this is impacting on science fiction? I'm going to start with Fran because we're going from the back to front. We'll come back. But Fran, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, I mean, it's important to observe the fact that we are all English-speaking, Western-focused writers on this panel. And I think that one of the things that has been happening for a while is that we're gaining awareness of other writers that have been writing for years and decades and generations, thanks to translators, thanks to people who are actively bringing new work into our pantheon. But we need to also be aware that, you know, we've spent so much time in publishing and in the West thinking that we are the fictional world navel, and there's so much going on out there that has been missed or has been, you know, hasn't had the reach because the translation isn't there or publishing isn't sending it out. And I'm looking forward to it just sort of erupting where there's lots and lots of different nodes of publication that we can access and read from. We saw that this summer in New Zealand, all of the New Zealand authors that were speaking out, the Maori authors that were coming out and sharing their stories with us. The idea of, you know, the Southeast Asian writers writing a steampunk collection a couple of years ago. It's gorgeous stuff. I just want to see more and more of it and more voices from everywhere.
Fair enough. Malka, what say you?
Yeah, I mean, the more, the better. I mean, okay, right now I just want to read Murderboat, but other than that, normally I want to read about stuff that I don't already know. The thing that turns me most off in a book is reading something that I already know what's going to happen. And again, that's me, because what I already know, somebody else doesn't. But I want to read stuff I don't know, and I want to read lots and lots of different stuff. I do want to keep being surprised by these futures. And so the more people we can have writing, the better. And like I said, I'm one reader, other readers are different. So we need lots of different writers to provide lots of different futures for lots of different readers who all have different needs and wants and resonances that will click. And with that, I think I'm going to sign off because it's almost 1 a.m. and I'm sorry.
Okay.
But it's been so great to see you all.
Thank you so
and
much.
This has been a great discussion. Thank you.
So good to see you, Malka. Bye.
So good to see you.
Bye, everyone.
Sleep well.
Okay. Yes. Bear. What do
Time
you
zones.
say?
We haven't talked about the terrorism and time zones. It's terrible.
We're all living in Cory Doctorow's Eastern Standard Tribe. You knew.
I was just going to say that.
Okay,
I like the
Bear.
phrase "the terrorism of time zones." Yeah, I mean, I think I addressed this a bunch in my answer to the first question we did, but to pick up on what Fran and Malka just said, like the biggest readership for SFF right now is in China. The SF World has millions of readers. I'm not even sure what the exact number is, but like a circulation that puts any English language science fiction magazine in a completely different tier of access. And the fact that we are finally in a technological situation where the terrorism of time zones and different languages doesn't mean that we can't interact with people around the world, is creating greater access for everyone to all of that literature. And I think that that's only going to increase, which is a little scary for me as somebody who makes my living doing this, because it means that the competition the level of the competition has just gone from North American to, global. But we'll cope. We'll all cope.
Sure. What say you, Charlie Jane?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to build on what I said earlier about how science fiction is really about the past, and really we're writing historical fiction. And I think that, part of what's really good about getting perspectives from outside of, the West and sort of, the global North or whatever, outside of the United States and Europe, is that there's a lot of stuff that we tend to sort of take for granted about our history that people might have a very different, perspective on if they came from places that had experienced colonialism and, globalism and some of these giant wars from a very different perspective. And I think that the more that we can kind of incorporate those other perspectives on history, the better our futurism will be, and the better our views of the more informed and the more kind of thoughtful our views of the future are going to end up being. I think that there's a great hunger for, different kinds of mythoses and different kinds of worlds. And I think that some of that has to come from, bringing, like, welcoming and valuing and appreciating voices that come from different cultural backgrounds to begin with, because I think that that's something you really can't get by just, reaching through to the same population and being like, I think that that's not going to work. And I think it enriches all of us. It enriches, like, I feel like I'm a better writer and a smarter thinker about the future from having read more books from, like, that more science fiction from other cultures and from other perspectives than I would have been otherwise.
Okay. I just want to interject myself and say, I've been reading science fiction since the early 1970s. I have survived the bestseller bloat of the 70s. I got through the cyberpunks and new romantics of the 80s. I got through whatever you want to call it happened when sort of the post-cyberpunk crowd came along in the 90s, the new space operas and everything. I think that what's happening now is the biggest change that I've seen in science fiction, period. I think that the change in perspective, that the broadening of the base of the field, the inclusion of different kinds of storytelling traditions is fundamentally broadening and deepening what's happening in science fiction. It's no longer possible to look at a story and say that a Clarion type story arc is what you want, or a Campbellian story arc is what you want. We look at we're beginning to look at story differently because we're being exposed to stories from China, from South Asia, from parts of Africa, from parts of South America. They have different storytelling traditions. What science fiction means, what the future means, is all seen differently in these parts of the world. They bring that into their stories. They bring that into what we see. And we're seeing it most vitally in short fiction, because it feels to me like that's where you see that first bubble of change, that first froth of things. And it's where translation is easiest, because you're translating a 6,000 word short story rather than a 150,000 word novel. I'll never forget being in London in 2014 and talking to the French translator for Neil Stevenson, his publisher, and how they were unable to get Anathem translated into French because it practically cost more money than they had to pay Neil or for printing the book to translate the book, right? So when you get around to these kind of things, it's like that is coming down and changing, and that is making it better for us. And it's not just are we seeing more people from around the world, we're seeing a broader spectrum of people and seeing their points of views brought in. And what I used to see was this view that, oh, well, we're just ticking off some kind of inclusion checklist. And not that I ever believed that was the case, but that's would be how it would hear back to me. What I'm seeing is that the kind of complexity of stories that we're seeing from diverse backgrounds is enriching and changing us. You know, the standard science fiction story, whether it be a space opera adventure or whatever it might be, is subtly deeper and richer as these different perspectives come in, and as we also include more and more people in those stories. So that's why I think it's so incredibly exciting, and why I think this, more than anything else, is the biggest, best thing happening. But anyway, the next question on the list, because I realize this is me moderating, not me paneling or something like that.
Can I actually say something to what you just said, if you don't mind? I think that there is also an explosion at novel length, where you look at even in just English language science fiction, where you look at people from cultures that have traditionally been underrepresented in Western publishing that are English speakers. All of the Nigerian and Nigerian American authors, the Indian authors, the Caribbean authors, who are people like Cadwell Turnbull, Karen Lord, Tochi Anubuchi, who are just Nnedi Okorafor. I could keep talking for half an hour, but you know that perspective is really also changing science fiction at the novel level.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, we'll do one last question and then see what else other questions we have from the audience, if anyway. Anyway, I just want to touch on climate change in a real way, because I think it's changing the stories we tell as well, and has become part of the melded background of science fiction. So with the world on fire, with California burning, I mean, we barely remember that half of Australia went up in smoke back in January. With climate change changing the world, do we see it changing science fiction and the stories we tell? Fran?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, nothing says that we are living in a changed world as much as the map of Colorado a couple weeks ago, where half of it was in ice and half of it was on fire at the same time. There is a big awareness of setting in much of science fiction. You cannot immerse your reader unless you immerse them in a setting, and all of our settings are either flooding or on fire right now. So it's got to be part of the discussion. It's got to be part of the discourse as far as how do we live in a changing world, and not just sort of engage in a hypocritical fondness for the past. Because I think that if we're honest, if we're doing what Charlie, Jane, and Bear have both said, that we're telling the story, the true story, we've got to invoke that change as well. I think a lot and very often about Genevieve Valentine's A Bead of Jasper, Four Small Stones, that ran 5-6 years ago, and it is about the drowning earth and people who have gone out beyond the earth, radioing back and watching it go. And we've got to talk about stories like that as well, because it's not just the news stories. It's not, we're always engaged in finding the news stories and where is science fiction going, but people have been telling these stories for years. And it's, I think, time to look back at those and say, okay, this is somebody that was getting it right, but where are the stories coming from now? I think they're coming from all over, and it's important to find those voices too.
Yeah.
Very much that. Climate change has always been such a focus in my work that this is a hard question for me to answer. I used to, sort of jokingly back on LiveJournal in the dim mists of history, refer to the stuff I wrote as, quote, eco-Gothic, unquote. And one thing that I've noticed as a change recently is that I think that there is a little more focus on, I wouldn't say a little more focus on, I would say that there are people who are writing stories that recognize the fact that there are people working very hard on solutions or mitigations, and that there's also the issue that whatever world we grow up in seems like the normal world to us. So, the catastrophic dystopian climate change future of 2050 is not going to seem weird to somebody who has only experienced that world. They're going to think we were awfully stupid for building below sea level. But we have a...
of today, they already think we're pretty dumb.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. No, you're great.
You're talking about us building below sea level. And
right, building below sea level, but the same way we can't imagine building a city without a sanitation system, right? Like, what do you mean they just dumped poop and dead rats in the street? That's going to be the future's attitude toward our current malfeasance.
Sure. Charlie Jane.
Yeah, this is an interesting moment to be writing and thinking about climate change, because we are literally at the 11th, we're at 11:59. We are at the very, very, very last moment where we can actually do something before we've hit a point where even our efforts at mitigation are going to be kind of feeble and ineffectual. We can't afford to wait any longer. There's way too much complacency. It horrifies and shocks me that there's a presidential debate happening tonight with no questions about climate change. And that feels like a failure, not just on the part of the political establishment and the news media, but on the part of all of us. That should not be possible if we were all making the noise that we should be making about this. This is an emergency, and I think that people have a hard time imagining something that they haven't seen yet. I think what Fran said before about people always thinking that the future is going to be like a straight line from the past. People have a hard time imagining a radically different future, and then it arrives and then it's like, oh, it's always been like this. But, I think that we do have an obligation, and I hate to be like, I said before, moral obligations for fiction make me itchy, but I think that there's work to be done. And I think that if you're talking about futurism is imagining a world affected by climate change. And I'm really grateful to you, Jonathan, that you did that book, Drowned Worlds, which really, that was such a great collection of stories that it really made me think about how to write about climate change again in a different way. And, I had a lot of that story that I wrote for that book led to me having a lot of really interesting conversations about I remember talking to Anna Lee. I'm like, oh, I'm writing a post-climate change story and I'm so sick of post-apocalyptic dystopias and I don't want to write one. And Anna Lee being like, well, then don't make it a post-apocalyptic dystopia. Make it a future where we're rebuilding and we're finding ways to cope with it. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay. And I think that, solar punk is a thing that is giving me hope. But I think we need to grapple with this. And I think we don't need necessarily a fiction to give us answers so much as fiction to just put the question at the forefront of our mind. Yeah. Fran has something to say, sorry.
I have a very good friend that talks to a lot of really smart people about the failure of imagination And it's not just the failure to see what's coming. Quite often we call these things black swan events that are actually just a pile of prose that have been stacking up slowly and nobody knows. And I think that one of the things that is really important, even in despair, is to imagine as much as possible and as hard as possible in all different directions, not just, what could possibly go wrong, but also what could possibly go right. And I think that's where we are.
Fair enough. Well, we were going to try and have another question, but we haven't had any more actual question. Oh, we have. Anonymous attendee has asked this question. SF creators have the skills to show better ways of doing things and warning of what will happen. How do you think they can work together to change the public narrative and work with the surrounding industries to model real change? Which seems to me like a huge question to slide in at the very end. But very quickly, Fran, how can we change the public narrative and work with industry to model real change?
Okay, look, if people only listened to me, I mean, it's very hard. There is definitely a Cassandra principle where you are screaming the truth at the top of your lungs in whatever method you use to yell. And everybody says, oh, that's nice. Isn't that cute? Or isn't that sweet? And meanwhile, you're over here gesturing like, this is what I've been saying. I think that it is not just the SF creators who have a moral obligation to engage in these things. I think it is the moral obligation of everybody in society to listen to each other better, because there are so many people that are actively engaged in just keeping their jobs rather than figuring out solutions to problems, that really everybody should be working on that more than just science fiction writers. But we've got some really good ideas, so you should definitely buy our books.
Bear?
I mean, we should also maybe try listening to scientists and engineers. I think that probably the most effective thing that science fiction writers can do at this point is point emphatically at the, climate scientists and the mitigation engineers and people like my friend Arkady Martin, who, recent Hugo winner and also secretly in her day job, is a city planner with a focus on, climate mitigation. Way too smart, way too many skills, that person. Just focus. We can only reach the people who are willing to read our books. We can only reach the people who are willing to listen to us ramble on panels or at events if we are given the opportunity to speak. But I think we can use whatever authority we have as people whose job it is to think about the future to point out that the future is quite literally on fire, underwater, and freezing. Right now, it's not even, science fiction is about the present. I don't know, like how many cities have to flood and wash away and burn down before it gets taken seriously.
And a final word, Charlie Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an activist. I'm bad at activism. I realized that a long time ago. I write stories. I make stuff up. I think it would be a terrible world if everybody was waiting for science fiction writers to get together and educate everybody else. I think that would be the worst dystopia I could imagine, to be honest. I mean, I think that science fiction writers, the strength of storytelling is that it can be weird and quirky and kind of personal and idiosyncratic, but I think that's also, in a way, that's a weakness because, we cannot substitute for scientists and engineers and policymakers and futurists and analysts, and we shouldn't. And I think that we can help to put these things in the front of people's minds, but asking us to organize or to do any kind of political, movement is a horrible, horrible idea. I do not want to be a part of a political movement led by science fiction writers. I think I would rather just go live in a hut somewhere.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, we should probably kind of wind up. We've over saloned for Saga. It's been more than an hour, but personally, I'd like to thank each of you, Charlie, Jane, Bear, Fran, Malka, who was here earlier, for being part of this. I'd like to thank all four of you for being part of the book, and everybody else who's in the year's Best Science Fiction Volume 1, which is out in the world. And now I'm going to hopefully throw back to our moderator or host, to Lauren Jackson, to wind up and say farewell.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Good, thanks to everyone. I feel like Jonathan said it all. Thanks again, everyone who's attending. Thanks to all the wonderful panelists. Jonathan leading the conversation amazingly. The book is called The Year's Best Science Fiction, Volume 1, and you can buy it at the link in the chat. All right, thanks, guys.
Okay, farewell. Bye.